Hey, it's Jordan here in Louisville, Kentucky. I am here with Josh Poe, and you are with the Root Cause Research Center. And you guys have been doing something really unique, basically putting together kind of a database of evictions called the Eviction Laboratory.
Louisville Eviction Lab.
Yeah, Louisville Eviction Lab. And it is really, really meticulously researched, so I want to know details about it. But the premise of it really is, I think a lot of people and the media has perpetuated this, that the national eviction moratorium that is supposed to end in 10 days now, that has protected all renters from eviction. Not the case, not the case. And here in Louisville, there's been a lot of folks evicted. So first, let me ask you kind of the nitty gritty. What is the Eviction Laboratory show?
Well, the little background, we started the Root Cause Research Center really to create what we call solidarity research. And we believe that poor and working class communities don't control the means of production for knowledge and data, that most of the knowledge and data that's produced in this country is produced by major institutions that normally have a financial interest in development and in capital. And so out of that, we get, dominant narratives are perpetuated. And so we not only do research, we also do organizing. And we do research in service to tenant campaigns and tenant organizing. And so we released the Louisville Eviction Lab during COVID, but we had been trying to get that data for a long time. It was really a lengthy process, a multiple year process of trying to ascertain that data from the Office of the Courts, and we signed a memorandum of understanding with the Office of the Courts last year and started releasing that data. And what we found essentially is that there is no eviction moratorium. The loopholes are so large that landlords were still able to evict based on a number of reasons. And so while landlords could not evict ostensibly for non-payment of rent, they could evict for all sorts of other reasons. Mm-hmm. And so what we found is a situation where capital was still moving in neighborhoods. We had massive bailouts for landlords. We had deferred mortgages. And so while capital was still moving, incomes were stalled or stagnant. And so it created the situation where a lot of landlords are now sitting on large reserves of capital, and they want to remodel their units. And in order to remodel their units, they are participating in mass evictions. And so they're evicting their entire buildings so they can rehab those units and rent them for higher rents once COVID is over. Mm-hmm. And so what we found is while evictions decreased, we still had about 10% of the evictions that normally occur.
Mm-hmm. And I want to drill back on, although they couldn't evict for non-payment, there was loopholes that allowed them to evict for other things. Can you kind of describe what kind of loopholes were they finding reasons to evict for?
Yeah, there were tons of loopholes. Primarily what we found is that landlords were using nuisance violations. So Louisville has a nuisance law, so if they could even suggest that the tenant was causing a disturbance or was participating in a nuisance violation, the judge would evict, really with no questions asked.
Even during a pandemic?
During the pandemic, yes. And so we also found instances where people's leases were simply up. So, the pandemic lasted so long, so many people's leases expired that the landlord would then evict them for simply having an expired lease. And so the loopholes didn't cover any of that. Another huge problem that we had is within the nonprofit service delivery sector. There was a major push by nonprofits and local government to really use rental assistance as an alternative to stopping evictions. And so there was a huge really a public information campaign by people. It happened here in Louisville, but it happened in other cities also, where there was a coalition of nonprofit service delivery organizations, local government, and landlords really worked together to hide the fact that evictions were happening, and in order to get more rental assistance to landlords, which were essentially landlord subsidies. And so what we found is that the landlords who were receiving the largest subsidies were also the largest evictors.
So the money was supposed to go to landlords to pay for the tenants who couldn't during the pandemic or what have you, but they were taking it, then evicting, and then doing this kind of cabal with nonprofits and other private companies to basically hide the evictions.
Exactly. That's exactly what happened. And we engaged with a lot of the nonprofit service delivery organizations early in the pandemic and really tried to form a coalition around canceling rent. While they were meeting with us, they were also meeting with the Louisville Apartments Association and large landlords to really elevate rental assistance and push that rental assistance. And so if you're a landlord and I'm a tenant, you can get rental assistance for, say, 2 months and cover my rent, but in that third month, you can still evict me. So at the end of that, people were still evicting, even though landlords received a massive amount of subsidies. And so there were really no stipulations on those landlords or no mechanism for accountability to make sure that they didn't raise rent after receiving the subsidy, to make sure that they didn't evict after receiving the subsidy. They were just handed, massive amounts of subsidies with no questions asked and no strings attached.
And can I ask you, call me a cynical person, do developers, other private companies that own some of these buildings, do they donate to local politicians here?
Well, of course, in a southern city like Louisville, what you have is a mechanism where capital is highly concentrated. And so the same entities that have the financial interest in development are also on the boards of philanthropic foundations and control a lot of the nonprofit decision making in that space. And so that's one of the problems with the nonprofit industrial complex is that there's a lot of political pressure to elevate service delivery over a more radical political analysis. And while there's nothing inherently wrong with service delivery, there is a problem when it comes at the expense of protecting people. And so what we find was, the problems inherent in service delivery and policy advocacy is that when the state wants to protect anyone, it rarely wants to protect everyone. And so no matter what happens, these giant loopholes are created and people still get left out of these protections.
What I find troubling about it, because I'm sure it's not just Louisville, if you have a federal eviction moratorium that essentially says can't evict people during a pandemic for non-payment, it seems like whether it's this or other things, people just assume that's the case, but there is all these loopholes that the federal government doesn't shut.
Yeah, and we would literally sit in eviction court and see, 20, 30 people evicted in a day and go talk to our local city council people, and they would argue with us and say, no, evictions aren't happening, there's a moratorium. So there's a massive amount of misinformation and lack of awareness around this issue. And the other, just to give an example, one of the largest landlords and property management companies in the city is All Trade Property Management. A slumlord in the sense that over 30-40% of their properties have code violations, a serial evictor. They were working very closely with the nonprofit community and Metro government on really directing rental assistance to themselves and other landlords. The COO of All Trade, who left in 2020, is now working in the housing department of Louisville Metro government on eviction prevention. Just to kind of give you an example of how siloed and fishbowled this mechanism is. And so what you have is an entire apparatus that is really set up. I mean, you have a legal system, that's kind of rooted in the very foundation of the country that is to protect the rights of property owners to profit from their property, and everything kind of grows from the roots of that. So everything we find in local government and the nonprofit sector are just branches from that system of basically settler colonialism and racial capitalism.
Well, what you just described also is kind of like the reverse DC lobbyist, because usually it's the politicians who then become lobbyists, but in this case, it's the real estate developer who's then going to the housing authority or to
local government, yeah, which is a strange situation, but for whatever reason, they thought that was a great career move. And but I think it kind of denotes this revolving door that exists, the folks who are not at the table in that equation are tenants and renters. There are no renters on the Louisville Metro Government Eviction Prevention Program, but there are a lot of landlords in that program. And so essentially in Kentucky, when we're talking about tenants' rights, tenants really have no rights. And no one is really going to advocate for tenants in this state or really across the South except tenants. And that's why at Root Cause Research Center, we're really focused on building tenant power and building up tenant unions rather than focus on, say, policy change at the state level or service delivery mechanisms. We want to get there, But this idea that we can just go talk to legislators and get better policies is kind of a ridiculous notion when those legislators are likely to be landlords themselves or invested in property in some way.
And I want to set the scene for the audience because we forget the human aspect here. You said you were seeing 20, 30 people being evicted a day in eviction court. What were the conditions like then? Because obviously not so long ago, we're talking December, January, before vaccines were more widely spread. You got 2,000 to 3,000 cases a day, hundreds of thousands of cases a day, 2,000 to 3,000 people dying. So as they were evicting these people, how bad was it in Louisville?
It was bad. And I mean, we also have to remember that in February we had 0 temperatures and single degree temperatures. And so I believe we had I think it was over 200 people were evicted in Louisville in February at kind of the height of the pandemic, and not only the height of the pandemic, in freezing temperatures. And so the human aspect of this is just completely lost. Most people in the city aren't aware of that at all, including the mayor, including members of Metro Council.
How could the mayor and the city council not know that this was going on? Is it ignorance, intentional blindness?
Yeah.
I would have to think they know that this revolving door is strong in action.
Yeah, I mean, you have to work hard to not know, right? And what's that Upton Sinclair quote? It's hard to convince someone of something when their salary is dependent upon them not knowing it. And I think that's the situation. That what you have is a situation essentially where real estate developers control local government to a certain extent and have a lot of influence over local government, and those large landlords donate heavily to nonprofits and political figures, and so it's intentional blindness completely.
And let's also just point out there's a racial aspect here too, because these landlords, and by the way, it's not just like mom and pop landlords, real estate developers. Now banks are buying up properties. They want to push poor people out, often black, Hispanic, either redo the place, high-rise luxury condos, or rehab the existing buildings to bring in more yuppie, upper middle class white folks.
Yeah, and that's what's happening in Louisville. You have a situation where the West End is being gentrified, the Russell neighborhood, Smoketown neighborhood's being gentrified.
The West End is largely African American.
Predominantly black neighborhoods are experiencing gentrification right now, and so there are massive profits to be made in those areas, right? And the massive profits come from the return on investment from buying properties that have depressed property values simply because black people live there. And in order to see those returns, developers are going to have to push poor people out of those areas. And so we have a situation that we documented in Smoketown where a local developer has a house for sale for $270,000 that he rehabbed in a neighborhood where the median income is about $25,000. And so that's, the income, the rent gap in terms of rents outpacing incomes was a real problem before COVID. It was already an emergency situation before COVID. With COVID, it just kind of poured gasoline all over this spark that was there. And so the moratoriums have held off the eviction somewhat. But we were very concerned before COVID about mass evictions in Louisville, and so the situation that could be coming post-moratorium could be devastating for a lot of black and brown families and poor families across the state.